So as Chris said, I'm going to speak about what partnering looks like in this industry, and I have to give some credit to Matt. Actually, Matthew, when he first contacted me to speak at this meeting, he asked me to talk more about the merger between Cytomedix and Aldogen, and then the agenda came out about a month later, and I saw this title. It was a little bit broader than I thought it would be, but I'm going to give it a shot today, and I think a lot of what I'll talk about will follow on with what we just heard, and hopefully set the table for the next discussion as well. So Cytomedix is a public company, and I will be talking a little bit about our activities, so I have to put up the forward-looking statements. So since we're talking about partnering, what I thought I'd do is just start with, why do companies partner? And I think, as you'll see as we go through here, there's a lot of different drivers for a partnership and why you would do that, including the obvious one, which is capital or access to resources. But additionally, things like risk mitigation, building a broader pipeline we just heard about, access to know-how and expertise, and then validation, which we just heard about. And as I walk through some of the buckets of what I think are the partnering buckets in this field, I think certain partnerships offer points on this list, not all of them, and some others do offer most of these attributes. So when I was putting together this presentation, because it got a little bit broader, as I mentioned, I decided to kind of put partnering into four different buckets. That being the typical kind of pharma partnership, then the government funding, which can be agencies or public funding, then kind of a new bucket, which is the kind of patient advocacy groups, or the Philanthrophy, which I think is a growing bucket of partnering, and then the peer-to-peer partnering, or the Biotech. And so what I'd like to do is kind of walk through each of these during the presentation, give you a sense of what I see happening in the stem cell therapy space regarding these partnerships, and also talk about some of our experiences at Cytomedix related to these differing partnering activities and what we've learned as part of that process. So to start, the one that I think everyone talks about is the pharma partnering aspect of this field. Clearly, there are a number of deals that have been done. There's not a lot. There's a few examples. I think the one that everyone talks about is the Cephalon deal with Mesoblast, which is now Teva, who's partnered with Mesoblast. That was a large deal, $350 million, hundreds of millions of dollars, and really, I think, put a nice spotlight on the field in terms of its partnering capabilities. Unfortunately, we haven't seen deals since then that are anywhere near the size of that. There have been some other deals done, the Genzyme Osiris partnership, which has since been dissolved. No Gil's here. The Pfizer Athersys collaboration that occurred a couple years ago. And then one that was recent, which I think is very interesting, was the Novartis partnership with the University of Pennsylvania on T-cell therapy, not stem cells, but T-cell therapy in cancer, which is an interesting mark because for a couple of reasons. One, that's an autologous therapy, and we've heard Pharma not being interested in autologous therapy because of the model. But again, shows an interest in the pharma space. So I think there's a few examples here, but not as many as we'd like to see. And one of the questions is, why is that? And I think we heard a little bit about the business model issue, the autologous versus allogeneic. Clearly, more comfort on the allogeneic side. Is pharma comfortable with this kind of technology? And then I think the one that I point to is really that, as a field, we really lack convincing phase 2 and phase 3 data. I think that's the tipping point that will probably bring pharma along. And clearly there's a lack of commercial products if you're not through phase 2 or phase 3. And then the other one I bring up, and I'm sure this will be a dialogue that occurs through the meeting, is that the nature of these companies, we are, I think, by and large, smaller companies, many of which are not fully capitalized. And so I think that brings some risk to a partnership from a pharma perspective. There's ways to mitigate that, but I think that all of these factors are bringing that forward. So given the fact that there's few examples of the pharma stepping into this space, where do you go? Or where are viable partnerships going to come from? And I think one of the good news in the field is that the government or government agencies have actually been fairly active in terms of stepping up and partnering in this space and providing funding. And maybe it's because they see the lack of big pharma support. So here's a couple examples of that, so you can see, and I know we'll hear from Celeron in the next session, where they received a large funding from BARDA for a radiation drug. That was in 2012. Then the ViaCyte Bluebird funding from CERN, the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. who's now beginning to do partnerships and funding and loans with actual companies, for-profit companies. And then Cytori on the bottom here, you can see another large grant from BARDA looking at their therapies for radiation injury. So, a nice track record there of some large funding from government agencies. So I wanted to talk about one of our recent announcements that we made related to partnering with kind of a government agency. So in December, we announced a collaboration or partnership with NIH to conduct a study in intermittent claudication patients or patients with peripheral artery disease. And then why this is unique, at least from our perspective, is the fact that we're utilizing a network that the NIH or NHLBI set up called the Cardiovascular Cell Therapy Research Network, or CCTRN. And this is a kind of a one-stop shop for actually getting cell therapy cardiovascular trials done in the United States. In the blue boxes below, you can see the number of sites that are part of this network. These are major institutions in the United States, including Texas Heart, Minneapolis Heart, Stanford, University of Miami. These are all places that have done a lot of cell therapy trials. And then they bring along with that a package of other capabilities like data coordination you can see here. They've got the DSMB through this organization. So basically, as a partner coming to them, you can basically do an entire trial with this network in place. And in fact, they actually have done a number of trials already. So they've done 3 trials. The TIME study, which was 120 patients using bone marrow mononuclear cells that was given 3 to 7 days post-MI. And then they did a late time study, 87 patients with bone marrow mononuclear cells, 2 to 3 weeks post-MI. And these studies have been reported out. Unfortunately, the data is not positive, but nonetheless, they've completed these studies. And then they did a focus study, which was in heart failure patients. So this network has actually now produced 3 trials. What they learned from that experience was that they were using a product, bone marrow mononuclear cells, that really wasn't a product. It was a process that they did internally at their various sites. And so they looked around and said the next generation of trials they want to do will be with a partner, because they want to have somebody commercially who's engaged who can take it to the next step if the original trial is successful. And so we had discussions with them that date back to a study that we did with a product. We have ALD-451. We did a study in critical limb ischemia, injecting our stem cell population into the legs of CLI patients. And we did this study at Texas Heart Institute, Indiana University, Duke University, so a number of the sites that were in the CCTRN. So they were very familiar with our cell population. And so when they were thinking about partnering the next phase of their studies, they came to us and said, would you be interested in doing another study in critical limb ischemia? And our answer to that was not really. And I think as people who understand the field, you've just seen the announcement from Astrom that they're stopping their phase 3 CLI study. That's a very difficult area to enroll. And particularly if you're looking at amputation-free survival as the endpoint, you need to have a very narrow patient population, which is, again, very difficult to enroll. So we had a conversation about, well, let's move upstream from that patient population into what we call the patients that have peripheral artery disease but are called intermittent claudication patients. So these are patients that have pain in motion but not at rest. There's about 4 times more of those patients than there are critical limb ischemia patients, and yet a large percentage of those patients actually move on to getting critical limb ischemia. So if you can prevent them from moving down that disease path, then you can have, I think, a pretty significant impact on the economics of this disease. So what ended up happening was we then agreed on intermittent claudication. We went forward and we put together a protocol, and we now we just had our first site come up and able to enroll in this study. It's called the PACE study, patients with intermittent claudication injected with ALDH bright cells. This is a significant study. This is an 80-patient phase 2 double-blind placebo-controlled trial, fully funded all by NHLBI and run by CCTRN. We provide the cells. We do the manufacturing of the cells for this study. The other interesting part about this is the endpoint. So the primary endpoint is safety. This is a first in man in this patient population. But from an efficacy perspective, we are looking at peak walking time, which is a regulatory endpoint the FDA would accept for a pivotal study. And then a couple other endpoints that that we think are interesting, because this will be the first time that MRI is used in a way to look at mechanism of action from an angiogenic perspective. And so you can see here a couple of the other measures which we think will provide a lot of data in terms of how these cells actually work. So, as I said, we're getting very close to enrolling here. Some of our lessons from this process is that this is a long process. It just took 2 years for us from the first time we had the discussions to the time now we're about to enroll. There are a lot of committees and such at NHLBI that we had to move through. And the other thing we learned was that there is a fine line between doing drug development and doing academic research. And we had a number of drag-outs with this group about what was needed from a clinical trial perspective. And I can say we won some of those and we lost some of those along the way. But I think by and large it's positive for us, because we've got some of the best thought leaders in the PAD area doing the study for us, and some unique mechanisms that make it worthwhile for us to provide the cells in this situation. All right, so moving on to the next bucket of partnering, looking at what I'm calling the patient advocacy groups or philanthropy. And this is kind of a new bucket, or it's a bucket that's, I think, gotten more active over the last few years. And I think it's driven by a commonality of interest in a specific disease area, or a personal interest that they take to a certain area. And clearly, there's some really nice examples of this funding coming from these sources into this field. So ADRF supporting Biocyte's development of the potential diabetes treatment. You can see on the right here the ALS work that Neuralstem's doing was supported both by NIH as well as by the ALS Association. And then you can see down at the bottom here, the New York Stem Cell Foundation got a $27 million grant from the Robertson Foundation. So the Robertson Foundation is Julian Robertson's personal foundation. So Julian Robertson is probably the most successful hedge fund manager in the world, or has been one of the most successful ones, and is now giving large amounts of money to cell therapies, stem cell research. And so again, I think a very active bucket. And just to talk a little bit about our experience in this area, so the Robertson Foundation actually donated $12 million to Duke University to build a cell therapy center, which included actually cell manufacturing and clinical expertise. Money went to Dr. Joanne Kurtzberg, who's probably well known by a lot of you in the room, who is a thought leader in the cord blood pediatric transplant area. And due to that relationship, we announced a collaboration with Duke focusing on using our cells for glioblastoma patients. And I'll get into that and why we're doing that. And that was actually funded through the $12 million grant from the Robertson Foundation. I guess in one of the ways you have to be opportunistic in this field, and this is an interesting story about how we actually got the money. So Joanne Kurtzberg was listening to a scientist at Duke who was doing the rounds, and some of the data he was showing was work that he had done on a stroke model, preclinical stroke model, using our cells. Some of this is the data that we show here, where we improve a function after giving our cells 2 weeks after a stroke. And she started putting kind of together, and her husband is Henry Friedman, who's one of the leading brain cancer surgeons in the world. So over dinner, they started talking about the potential that these cells may help his patients, which because of surgery and radiation and such have cognitive decline. And so all that discussion led to this study, which is what we call our ALD-451 study, which is using these cells to try to treat the neurocognitive and patient-reported kind of decline that's due to surgery, radiation, and the chemotherapy that happens in these patients. And we'll give our cells IV in an open-label 12-patient study. Again, the Robertson Foundation is paying for this study, and again, an area that we can now expand into and see if, again, we're not treating the cancer itself, but trying to treat the side effects of that treatment. And again, from a lessons perspective, again, this was a long process as well. The money to get to the Robertson Foundation to Duke was a couple-year process, and then to get the trial and going was about 1.5 years. What's interesting about this, I think from a company perspective, is in dealing with institutions that are getting money from a source like the Robertson Foundation, is that they're they don't want to make the connection, right? Because they have the relationship with the Robertson Foundation. They'd like to keep that themselves and then kind of push the money through. And so we never had a lot of discussions with the foundation, but I will say they're very diligent, and they've kept us to milestones in terms of the IND filing and getting patients enrolled. We're actually enrolling patients in the study. So from that perspective, it's been an interesting experience along the way. So the last bucket I want to talk about is the kind of biotech or peer-to-peer, and we heard about this in terms of the consolidation, and you can say, well, the kind of the combination of entities, why is that a partnership? And the truth is, I think it is a partnership because most of these deals are happening in terms of an equity swap. And so it's not an exit, it's not a cash outlay in most cases. And so, the question is, can you put these together and, 1 + 1 = 3? And we've had a number of examples here in Europe, obviously the Tygenix and Celerix combination. We've seen Neostem purchase progenitor cell therapy and try to create a larger entity, a more scalable entity. And then more recently, we saw Biotech acquire the stem cell assets from Geron, again, trying to build a more robust stem cell company. And I know we'll probably hear more about that, I think, tomorrow. So, I think it's happening in this space, but to the speaker earlier, probably not fast enough, maybe, to what we could say. And what I wanted to do is just talk what I was originally supposed to talk about, which was the deal that we did, which was the merger between Aldogen and Cytomedix. And it did have and this was the headline, did have a $40 million stock deal value, but as I go into it, that valuation is really dependent on the success of this company going forward. So just to give you a little bit of sense of what this transaction looked like, so it was the merger of Aldogen and Cytomedix, $40 million transaction. 40% of that came in upfront stock in the public company that was given to the shareholders of Aldogen. 60% was kind of a back-ended performance-determined milestones based on the RECOVER stroke study, our phase 2 study in stroke, based on milestones in terms of safety and enrollment, and then ultimate clinical outcome. We eliminated the financing risk associated with this deal. We raised $5 million from Aldogen's investors with part of this deal, as well as $3 million from warrant exercise. So we covered the cost of doing the phase 2 stroke study out of the gate. And then all of the shares are locked up for a fairly long period of time so that our shareholders are in it for the haul. They're in it to see all these milestones come through. And then we got 3 board seats through the merger. So in fact, it really was a kind of a combination, not a merger. And we're all incentive, obviously, to make sure that this is a success because the value of this is in shares valued at the price that the deal was done. So if we can appreciate the value of the company over time, then those obviously the $40 million becomes, 2 or 3x that if we can be successful in building our company. And, just for, a little bit about Rationale. I mean, from a Cytomedix perspective, they were a company that had 2 commercial products in the marketplace. Those commercial products are doing about $13 million a year in revenue. They wanted to build a robust pipeline behind that in the regenerative medicine space. So they got, through the Aldogen acquisition, they got a pipeline, they got cell manufacturing, they got the capabilities to do that in, much quicker than they could do it themselves. And there is a fit between their commercial pipeline, their commercial products, and the pipeline. And from an Aldogen perspective, we heard it earlier, it mitigated investor risk. We now have a broad pipeline. We've got commercial products. We've got pipeline products. We're now part of a public company, which allows us to raise money from different sources than we were able to as a private company. And there's a clear pathway to liquidity. Those shares will come out from under the lockup, and if we're successful, our shareholders will be able to become liquid through this deal. And I think one of the keys to success here is that the companies, we did this deal from the first time we met them to the time we concluded the deal was about 4 months. So it happened fairly quickly, and I think this is the reason there was a shared vision. There was a shared vision in the future of regenerative medicine, what it could become. Both of our companies are working on autologous treatments. We're looking at kind of isolation or fractionization technology so that there's a common technology. And we have a shared vision of how we create value by doing good clinical work and getting appropriate reimbursement, et cetera. So I think that helped move this process along quite quickly. And I think right now, I think the jury's still out. We've been at it for about a year, and we've had some, some of the milestones that we contemplated going into the deal have happened. A couple of them have not happened. But I think going forward, and I think our shareholders follow this, it's a long-term process, and over the next year or two, I think the vision that was shared will play its way out. And this is actually what ended up being the pipeline and the products. So again, 2 commercial products, 2 phase 2 products, including the 301 that I mentioned with the CCTRN collaboration, and then the 451 products in phase 1. So a fairly robust pipeline, and again, commercial products generating profitability that we hope longer term will actually pay for all of the development work that we have. So maybe to get back to the original question, what does partnering look like? So this is my summation of kind of what it looks like. I think it looks a lot like other technology areas. I mean, if you look at the deal structures, they're fairly similar in terms of upfronts and royalties and milestone-based. The issue is that the volume is just a lot smaller. There's just fewer of them, and I think that's an indication of where we are as a field. There's, we're less advanced than the monoclonal antibody field or other technology fields, but I think that will change. As I said, Pharma is reluctant, but the government agencies have stepped up. I think there's a lot of funding there that's been made available. I think the patient advocacy groups in the philanthropy area is one that will only continue to grow and I think become more active. And I think as a group, as an industry, we need to understand better what their motives are and better find ways to work with them on different models. And then I think it's obvious the capital constraints are actually driving, I think, some unique structures and more peer-to-peer combinations. And I think we'll see more of that. Hopefully, as the speaker said earlier, I think that would be good for the industry. So with that, I'll wrap it up and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was absolutely perfect.